the next homework assignment onto Blackboard, and you've only got until Wednesday for this one. And it's 8 problems long. So that sounds like a lot, but they're all pretty much the same problem, 8 times in a row. So, I mean, not exactly, but I'm not sure why I hammered the same thing over and over again. I guess it's because it's a simple concept, and I kept getting blown away in the final exam that people weren't getting it. So I just added a few more reps on this one in the homework. So I think that you'll find it's actually a pretty easy assignment, and it's all built on the things that we're going to be talking about today. But it is a quick turnaround, and it is a lot of problems, but it's all pretty closely related. So I don't think that you'll find that too overwhelming. Homework 11. And then the project's just around the corner. We are at about, I guess, 3 weeks for the project. So does anybody have any questions about the announcements? No. All right. We're moving on to chapter 14 in the book. We're going to be talking about inflation. And we've discussed inflation in some general terms already this semester, and so I think you're probably already acquainted with what it is. We're going to be talking about how we account for inflation when we do time value of money calculations. So the government gathers a lot of pretty interesting data to help us understand inflation. The government doesn't directly control inflation. Inflation isn't Joe Biden's fault. It's not Trump's fault, not directly. Indirectly, who knows, maybe. But the government does try to assess the growth and increase in prices. And there's 2 main ways that that gets characterized. 2 competing indexes that are put together by 2 different government offices, and they measure slightly different things. And so the most widely known index of inflation is called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. If you listen to like financial podcasts or business news, you'll hear people referring to the CPI, and it's generated by a division of the Department of Labor called the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what they do is they send people out to grocery stores with little price scanners to see how much things cost. And they're looking for a very specific list of things. They're looking at all aspects of household spending, everything from energy to food, rent, transportation costs, healthcare costs. And so there's a fixed basket of goods and services. Like the government says, it's going to check to see what is the price of, just hypothetically, a dozen eggs, a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, a gallon of gasoline. And so they have these things that this basket doesn't change very often. They just have a fixed order, and they look to see what's the total cost of that order, and they go to a lot of different stores in a lot of different cities to gather the data. There are probably thousands, if not tens of thousands of people working on generating this consumer price index. And so let me show you what the data looks like. Every so often, the Bureau of Labor Statistics will put out a press release and summarize how prices have changed in the preceding month. And so you can see the categories that they're breaking down, like food that you'd eat at home, and then food you'd eat away from home, meaning like restaurants or snacks that you'd maybe carry with you on the go. The energy is a category. All other items besides food and energy, and so that may include like clothing, vehicle, transportation, medical care. So this is just a very broad summary. If you go through all of the different subcategories of things that they're measuring, it's page after page, because it's everything from like wheat bread, non-wheat bread, cereals that include oats. It's like such a really long list of things that they're going out and assessing. And so what this is showing is that on a 12-month basis, that from September 2024 to September 2025, the rate of inflation in the Consumer Price Index was 3% on an annual basis. And so from last September to this September, prices went up 3%, and this is of the basket of goods that people would usually purchase. And so that's the Consumer Price Index. That's one of the ways that inflation is assessed. The other is similar in some ways. It's called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or the PCE. The agency that puts the PCE together is called the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So it's a completely different government office. And the difference is that there's two big ones. The two big differences are that whereas the CPI only includes spending by individual households, the PCE includes household spending and then also spending that's done on behalf of households. And what that means is that me, for example, as an employee of Marshall University, Marshall is spending money to buy health insurance for me. And so if you look at my spending, that's only part of the story because there's this expenditures that are being done on my behalf. And so this PCE includes a lot of healthcare expenses that aren't necessarily weighted in the CPI. So that's one part of it. And then the other thing about the PCE is that they have a more dynamic idea of what gets included into the so-called basket. Whereas the CPI is a pretty fixed basket, and it may be years and years before they change, the 1 gallon of gasoline, the loaf of bread. Like the things that go into the basket doesn't change very often for the CPI. But the PCE is a little bit more sophisticated in acknowledging that when the price of one thing goes up dramatically, there may be substitutions that are available. That an individual, for example, maybe they were buying a cereal that contains oats, but now suddenly if there's some sort of a blight and the oat crop fails and now Cheerios double in price, maybe people would switch to Rice Krispies. And so the CPI doesn't reflect the substitution effect, whereas the PCE does. And so for that reason, the Central Bank of the United States generally relies on the PCE to understand how inflation is changing, because it's more holistic in that it includes more healthcare spending and the item weighting changes are more dynamic. So that's just an idea, and if we look at the actual data that was recently released by the PCE, they're saying that the inflation in the last 12 months was 2.7%. And so why is it lower? It's lower because people would substitute cheaper alternatives for the things that have a more stiff increase in prices. And it may also reflect the healthcare spending. Maybe just coincidentally in the last year, it didn't grow as much as some of the other spending did. So that's how we understand inflation, is by sending people out and actually checking prices. Any questions about this so far? So back in the olden days, when you could get a car, a really long car that's really wide, and look, it's wide enough that there's 3 people in the front seat, and it's not like they're sitting shoulder to shoulder either. I don't even know how that thing would fit on the road. It looks like an absolute tank. But the 1950 Hudsons, there was the Pacemaker, the Famous Super, and the Custom Commodore. They look pretty nice, big cushion tires, lots of chrome. But this vehicle back in 1950 sold for $2,365. So that's pretty low compared to the cost of vehicles now. Here's another look at just some used cars back then. You could get a 1948 Dodge pickup for $795. Just in general, vehicles were cheaper, but of course people earned less money back then. The average U.S. household income in 1950 was $3,300. So as a fraction of household income, it's about 2/3 of a year's salary going into the car back then. Now think about how cars were made back then. They didn't have robots. They were hand assembled. And a lot of the materials also weren't produced by robots. And so think about the mining that went into the steel production. It was a lot more labor intensive than mining now, where we've got gigantic machines that drive the cost of production lower. So in one way, it's kind of surprising that the car was as cheap as it was when you take into account that the manual labor was a bigger fraction of the vehicle production, and that just the materials themselves were likely more expensive. So if we think about how much vehicles cost today, let's take this truck as an example. This is currently available for purchase in St. Albans. It's a Ford F-150 Platinum, $72,000. The only one that was more expensive than this, there was a Raptor. It was like 90 something, and then there was something below the Raptor. I forget what it was called.
King Ranch?
No, I didn't see a King Ranch. Maybe that they had a 250 in that trim, but I just was looking at 150s. But it's a lot. 72,000 versus 2,300. But if we compare it to a fraction of income, the average U.S. household income today is $84,000. So as a percentage, that's more than 2/3. What we saw back here was this was about 2/3 of the annual salary. Now it's more than 2/3 of the annual salary, and it's actually even worse than that if you think about it, because back in 1950, the average household only had, in general, one wage earner. Generally, women stayed home, men worked, and so the $3,300 salary was one person's earnings in general. Whereas here now, today, the average U.S. household generally has two wage earners, where both the man and the woman, or whoever, two people have both gone to work, and so the incomes are higher, but this is representing two people's labor. So why are cars so expensive today when we've got robotic manufacturing and the materials costs should be lower because of improvements in automation? Anybody have any sense for why it is that cars are a higher fraction of spending?
I mean, they're inelastic, kind of. You have to have a car nowadays to get anywhere.
Okay. So it's
try-
inelastic. So you definitely have to have a car, but there are other. You don't have to buy a Ford. You could buy a Chevy. Why are cars so expensive?
Because we pay it.
Because people are willing to, because people demand more features. Like, so automatic windows. We just kind of take that as like a standard feature now. Like, when was the last time you saw roll-up windows? You may not even be able to find any vehicle for sale now that has roll-up windows. Air conditioning, standard feature. Like the worst, junkiest car sold in the United States is going to have air conditioning. Like Apple CarPlay, like just we've come to expect more features. And so part of it, I think, is that hedonistic adaptation effect that I talked about when we were discussing the project. But then another part of it is that there are a lot more required safety features than there used to be. When you drove this thing around, your life was in your hands, literally. They didn't even have seat belts, much less shoulder seat belts. There's no airbags, no anti-lock brakes. These were really dangerous vehicles, whereas now cars are mandated to have backup cameras, anti-lock brakes. They have to have seat belts and airbags, and so there's just a lot more engineering that goes into them. They're more complex. So prices went up over time is the main story here, and inflation throughout history has varied a lot. This figure goes all the way back to 1775. And so what I hope you'll notice in this figure is that early in our country's history, there were really wide swings in inflation, where some years prices could go up by 30% of the previous year. And then maybe a little bit while later, prices could go down by as much as 20% in a year. But those fluctuations have dampened over time. And part of the reason for that dampening is that we understand more about economics, that the central bank has been empowered to manage the money supply in a way that didn't used to be true, and they're changing interest rates to reflect the balance between trying to have full employment on the one hand but not have too much inflation on the other. The central bank in the United States has two missions. Most central banks across the world only have one mission, the mission being to control inflation. But here in the U.S., the mission is to control inflation and also to try and ensure full employment, which most people generally accept as being about 5% unemployment is full employment. You never have 100% employment because people are generally going to be looking for jobs, or some people are not really qualified for any position, or maybe they're just terrible workers, but 5% is considered good according to economists. And in terms of inflation, the goal for a lot of years was 2% inflation. That's what they were aiming for, was to keep inflation at 2% or lower. Now they're starting to say, well, maybe 3% is okay, mainly because they can't get it back down to 2% without making people squeal. If we zoom in on more recent history, we've got some data that shows wage growth during these same years. And so try and remember the pattern, the shape of this. This is inflation, which is changes in prices. And so it has a really similar pattern if we look at wage growth. Part of what drives increasing prices is when people have more money. When wages go up, prices often follow. But another interesting trend, besides price inflation occurs when wage growth occurs, which makes sense because there's more demand for goods when people have more money. The other effect that this figure shows is that wages fall during periods of recession. So here, these segments that are highlighted, shaded in blue, represent some periods of recession. I don't remember what caused this recession back in 1990. I don't remember. But this one was the dot-com bubble, as they called it. It was when people were really excited about the internet in the late 90s, and they over-invested in internet companies. And then everybody kind of realized, we've overpaid. We've put too much money into internet stocks. And so there was a big crash in the economy, the dot-com bubble. Then this one was the housing bubble, and the bubble burst when the prices of housing kept going up, and people were being given loans for homes that they couldn't afford. So there was a reduction in loan quality, and then people stopped paying their mortgages, and so there was an economic crisis that was related to that. This doesn't show that we had a brief period of recession associated with COVID back in 2020. And a lot of people are talking about how there's probably going to be a recession, like that there's probably a bubble having to do with AI, like Anthropic, OpenAI, NVIDIA. People are thinking they're maybe overvalued relative to the actual impact they're having on the economy. So it'll be interesting to see. But it's important trends that you have to know about. When wages go up, demand go up, and that's what causes inflation. Because if producers are facing more demand for their products, then they are empowered to increase prices. And so the technical definition for inflation is an increase in the amount of money needed to obtain the same amount of goods or services. So if we looked at a loaf of bread a year ago, probably that price would be different than that same loaf of bread now. If we express it as a percentage, then the inflation rate is assigned the variable F. So I, we usually use to mean interest, where F will be the inflation rate. So a percent annual basis change in the value of currency. So the value of the currency is its ability to buy things. So if you have a savings account that is only paying the same as inflation, then what that means is that your purchasing power is preserved, but you don't have an increase in purchasing power over time. So if your bank is paying you 3% for your deposits, but inflation is also 3%, then you're not actually getting any additional value out of the money by saving it instead of spending it today. I mean, just unless you need to buy things in the future that you can't buy today. So that's where this idea of the real interest rate comes in. If you subtract out the effect of inflation, then the real interest rate is what remains. And so, if you account for what you're earning on your deposit at the bank, and then you also account for the effect of inflation, what you're hoping is that you have an increase in purchasing power. And if you do, that means you'll have a positive real interest rate. But a lot of times the real interest rate will be negative. For years, banks were paying less than inflation, and so what that meant is that your money was actually losing purchasing power while it was at the bank, because in 1 year, yes, you'd have more dollars, but the price of things would have increased more quickly than the number of dollars you had by leaving it into the bank. So real interest rate is something that we need to understand to ensure that we're not falling further behind in terms of how much we can purchase. Okay, so the market interest rate is just what you earn from the bank. We sometimes also call that the inflation-adjusted interest rate. So that's I sub F. That's what the bank is actually paying you. That's the interest rate that they advertise as the inflation-adjusted interest rate. And I know that that term is a little bit counterintuitive because it makes it sound like that would be the interest that you're earning after you subtract out inflation, but that's not it. That's real interest rate. So the inflation-adjusted interest rate is just what is being paid. So if you want to have an increase in purchasing power of I and you're experiencing inflation F, then I sub F would be what you need to earn in order to achieve the real interest rate target that you have of I. And we've got a formula for how we can account for the inflation-adjusted interest rate. And what it relates to is this time value of money calculation that we've seen plenty of times before, where we know that the future value is the present value multiplied by 1 plus I to the power of n. So if we rearrange this to solve for P, then it's P is F divided by 1 plus I to the power of n. Now, if the rate that we're talking about is the inflation rate rather than just some interest rate, we can just substitute the variable F in there. So it's the growth in prices as a percentage basis for 1 year. That's F in the formula. But we also need to account for the interest, the real interest rate that we want to earn. So that's I. So combining the two together, if we're accounting for the effective inflation and the interest that we want to earn, then here is the inflation-adjusted interest rate, I sub F, as a function of the real interest rate and the inflation. And then as this third term, we have to multiply the two together. So just to reiterate this point, I is the real interest rate, and that is the one that's associated with an increase in purchasing power. F is the inflation rate, and I sub F is what you would have to earn in order to achieve a certain real interest rate with the inflation rate that you're experiencing. So just as an illustration, let's say that you've got a basket of goods. And you can buy this basket of goods today for $25. If the prices are inflating by 3% every year, then there's compounding. The same way that we've seen compounding in every other aspect of money, the price in 15 years is going to experience that same effect of compounding. And so we can calculate the future cost of that basket of goods by putting in the present cost of $25 and then multiplying it by 1.03 to the power of 15. So if we do that, 1.03 times to the power of 15 and multiply it by $25, then in 15 years, that $25 basket of goods is going to cost $38.95. Now, let's say in parallel with that, you're saving some money, because maybe you want to be able to buy this basket of goods in the future because you're going to be retired. What if you don't have an income in the future? So let's say that I take $25 and I put it in the bank, and the bank pays 7% interest. I'm really fortunate, and I found a bank that's paying 7%. So how many baskets of food could I purchase in 15 years if the rate that the bank is actually paying is 7%? Well, we need to know how many dollars I'll have. And the number of dollars I have is based on the market interest rate of 7%. So the number of dollars I'll have is $68.98. And so if I divide that number of dollars by the price per basket, it turns out that I could buy 1.77 baskets of food. So this is an illustration of where I had an increase in purchasing power over time, where that $25 in the future, because it grew at a rate faster than inflation, allowed me to buy more things in the future. So that's what we like to see. We like to see an increase in purchasing power. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I had one.
Yeah.
It's not really related to this slide, but I wanted to ask earlier. You said banks control interest rates to change inflation. Is that related to like interbank loaning? Is that what the interest rates are for?
Yeah. So the central bank controls inflation by, they have a short term, like an overnight rate that they'll lend money to banks, like commercial banks that we have here in the area, like Huntington Bank, Chase Bank, and so on. They're required to have a certain amount of money on hand at any time. Like they loan money out to people, but then they have to have a certain amount to be able to satisfy deposits, like people who are coming to take out their deposits. And so they may need to borrow money just overnight or for a short period of time to meet those minimum requirements, and they go to the federal government to borrow that short-term money. And so the federal government decides how much it's going to cost to borrow that money at the short term, and then that kind of sets at the ground level all of the other interest rates in the all the other interest rates that are being charged. So like the bank, if they're borrowing money for 3% from the federal government, then they're not going to loan money out for less than 3%. So it's kind of like that is the master variable, how much they're charging all of the private banks. And then in terms of like long term, what sets the interest rate, it kind of goes to what's the demand for treasuries, which are like U.S. government debt obligations, where the U.S. government is trying to raise money to pay for infrastructure or the military or just to pay previous debt. They sell treasuries on an auction, and depending on how much demand there is for treasuries, then that kind of sets what the interest rate is, because people bid what interest rate they're bidding on the price they're willing to pay for the treasury bill or treasury bond, and then that sets the yield on it. So they're considered, treasuries are the most reliable, safe investment, and then that's kind of becomes the long-term baseline for interest rates, is what people are tending to earn on treasuries. So good question. Are there others? All right. Let me give you this in-class exercise, and we're going to get some practice differentiating between the real interest rate, the inflation-adjusted interest rate, and inflation. So I think it's a good idea to write the variable next to the percentages in the problem statement. That way you can kind of keep track of which interest rates they're referring to where. So here in this example, they're saying the item that costs $5,000 now, I guess I could just label that as P, like that's the present cost of the item, will experience 4% per year price inflation. So that 4% is the F variable. So part A, we don't need to know anything about the interest that we're actually earning, because it's just asking what will be the cost of the item in 5 years. And the cost of the item only depends on inflation. It doesn't depend on how much interest we're earning. So the item will cost $6,083.26 in 5 years. And then in part B, it says we want to earn a real interest rate of 10%. And so that means that I is 0.1, and we're trying to figure out what is I sub f. Like what rate would a bank need to pay you in a 4% inflation environment so that you are earning a real interest rate of 10%. So if the bank pays 14.4, then that accounts for the inflation effect and also gives you the 10% per year increase in purchasing power, which is real interest. So it would have to be 14.4 that they're paying. That's the inflation-adjusted interest rate. And so part C is maybe the trickiest part, because it's saying how much should you invest today to purchase the item in 5 years. And what I wrote on the whiteboard is that we know what the price is going to be in the future. We calculated that the price in the future will be $6,083.26. So that's how many dollars we need to have in 5 years. And then, now the question is, how are we going to earn those dollars? We're going to earn it by depositing some money now. It's going to earn the 14.4% because that's what the bank is actually paying. So this 14.4% is the one that governs the number of dollars you'll have in the future. And so if we use that interest rate to calculate the number of dollars that there need to be in the future, it should be $3,104.60 would be how much you need to put into that account now to ensure that you've got $6,083 in the future. So on that homework assignment I was telling you about, the one with 8 problems, really the practice is just identifying, you know, like which money are they talking about? Are they talking about money now or money in the future? Which interest rate are they talking about? Are they talking about the real interest rate, the inflation-adjusted interest rate, or is it some percentage which was referring to the inflation? So there's a couple of moving pieces, not too many. All right, now this next problem is asking about the price of an Airbus 380. Has anybody flown on an Airbus 380? I flew on one only one time, and they are spacious. That is a double-decker airplane, really big. It's smooth, it's quiet, very comfortable. But they don't fly them very much anymore because they take 4 engines, and so it's just not as fuel efficient as 2-engine aircrafts like the Airbus 380 and Boeing 777. But anyways, if the price was $340 million for this aircraft, and we expect it to inflate at 9% per year, then how many years would it take for the price to increase to $500 million? And I wanted to remind you of the log functions. So we know that f is p times 1 plus some rate. Let's say if it's the inflation rate to the power of n. And so we could rearrange that another way and just say that f divided by p is 1 plus lowercase f to the power of n. And if we took the log of both sides, then what we'd end up with is the log of f divided by p is equal to n times log 1 plus f. And so the reason why we would take the log of both sides is that it gets the variable we're trying to solve out of the exponent and makes it easier for us to solve. Now, you could put it into a calculator or an equation solver without having to take the log of each side, and you could solve for n if you use a numerical solver. But this approach allows us to calculate it directly. So let me pause for a moment, give you a chance to write all this down, and then also calculate how many years until the price crosses the $500 million threshold. So it'll take 4.475 years before the price crosses that $500 million threshold. So with all that, I think you can get a pretty good head start on this assignment that's due Wednesday. We may cover one or two additional things on Monday that fold into that assignment, but for the most part, it's just the effects of inflation and time value of money. So I'll see you on Monday. Happy Halloween.